For over 2,000 years, the story of Jesus has been a powerful source of faith. But what happens when we look at the Gospels not just as sacred texts, but as historical documents? Well, today we're going to dive into a really fascinating review of scholar Elaine Pagels' new book, which looks at the very human reasons behind some of the Bible's most incredible stories.
This is the big one, right? It's the question that's driven centuries of scholarship and debate. It asks us to, just for a moment, set aside theology and put on our detective hats. We're going to investigate the story behind the story. What was going on back then that made the gospel writers tell these stories in the specific way they did?
So our guide for this exploration is the book Miracles and Wonder by the incredible scholar Elaine Pagels. Now, what's so important to get here is that this book isn't trying to prove or disprove the miracles themselves. Nope. Instead, it's digging into the really complex historical and cultural pressures that shaped how these amazing stories were told in the first place.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll start by setting up the historical mystery. Then, we're going to look at three huge moments, what Pagels calls sticking points: the birth, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. And finally, we'll uncover what Pagels thinks was the ultimate goal of the gospel writers. All right, let's get into it. The whole idea here is about deconstruction. Think of it like taking a watch apart to see exactly how all the little gears fit together. We're trying to understand how these stories were built and, maybe more importantly, why they were built that way. We're looking for the human fingerprints on a divine story. So Pagels zeroes in on three major sticking points. These are the big, miraculous, and honestly most debated parts of the story: the virgin birth, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. Her thinking is that by really examining these moments, we can get a whole lot closer to what the writers were actually trying to accomplish.
Okay, first up is the story of Jesus' birth. It's probably one of the most famous stories on the planet, but it turns out it's got a pretty fascinating backstory of its own.
We all know this one, right? Born to a virgin, in a manger. It's the classic Christmas card scene. And in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, it's presented as this beautiful, miraculous event, a cornerstone of the whole narrative. But if you're looking at this with a historian's eye, you gotta ask, why was the detail of a virgin birth so absolutely critical? I mean, why do the writers feel the need to emphasize that specific point? Were they just reporting a miracle, or was there something more strategic going on? And here's where it gets really interesting. Pagels makes a powerful case that the virgin birth story wasn't just about a miracle. It was actually a direct and, frankly, brilliant response to a really damaging social problem. There were rumors going around that Jesus was an illegitimate child. Look at how clearly this lays it out. On one side, you've got this really nasty rumor that could totally undermine Jesus' authority. On the other, you have this incredibly powerful counterstory. By saying God was his father, the narrative doesn't just deny the rumor, it flips it on its head. It turns a potential source of shame into the ultimate claim of divine power. It's just a masterclass in strategic storytelling. Okay, next up, we're moving from social pressures to some very real political dangers. The crucifixion is, of course, the climax of the Gospels, and according to Pagels, the way it was told was massively shaped by the dangerous reality of living under the Roman Empire. So the Gospels give us this very vivid scene, right? Pontius Pilate, the Roman guy in charge, seems like he doesn't want to do it. He famously washes his hands of the whole thing. Meanwhile, it's the Jewish leaders and the crowds who are really pushing for Jesus' death. But here's the thing. History is pretty clear that crucifixion was a uniquely Roman punishment, specifically for crimes against the state. The official charge from Rome against Jesus was insurrection. Let's just be clear, that's basically treason. And in the Roman Empire, treason was a capital crime, period. So for his followers trying to spread his message after he was executed, being associated with a convicted enemy of the state was unbelievably dangerous. It could literally get you killed. And this just shows the strategic genius at play. By shifting the focus of the blame onto Jewish authorities, the story reframes Jesus' death. Suddenly, it's not about rebellion against Rome, it's more of an internal religious conflict. And that made this new Christian movement seem way less threatening to the Romans, which created a much safer space for the faith that actually survive and grow. All right, our final sticking point is the resurrection itself. And this one is fascinating because, while the Gospels we have today seem pretty clear, Pagels shows that the very earliest Christians were actually divided on what exactly happened. This meant the writers had to make a really important choice. So the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John, they talk about a very physical event, an empty tomb, a body that people could actually touch. But, and this is a huge but, the Apostle Paul, who was writing even earlier than the Gospel authors, described the resurrection as a spiritual transformation. So why the change? Well, think about it. A physical resurrection offers tangible, concrete proof. It's a much more compelling and easier to understand message if you're trying to attract new followers, compared to a more abstract spiritual idea. So we've looked at the birth, the death, and the resurrection. Now it's time to pull all these threads together and ask that big question. What was the end game for these writers? I mean, if they were responding to rumors, navigating huge political risks, and picking and choosing between different theological ideas, what does that really tell us about their overall mission? What were they trying to build here?
This quote from the review of Pagels' book just hits the nail on the head. The gospel writers weren't just taking notes. They were actively shaping a story. They were reacting to the challenges of their world and strategically building a message that could survive, spread, and bring people in.
You can almost see their process here, laid out like a playbook. Step 1, they looked around and understood the world they were in, all the risks, all the rumors. Step 2, they tackled those problems head-on in their writing. That led to Step 3, crafting a message that was not only powerful, but also politically smart. And the final goal, Step 4, to make sure this new faith would last and hopefully flourish. So, here's the big takeaway. Looking at the Gospels this way doesn't have to diminish their power. In fact, it can add this whole new layer of appreciation for them. You start to see them as these brilliant, strategic documents written by people under enormous pressure, trying to protect and grow a movement they truly believed in. And that kind of leaves us with one final big question to chew on. When we understand the why behind a story, the real-world problems it was designed to solve, how does that change what that story means to us, right here, right now? It makes you think, doesn't it?